Welcome to the Ranchonomics Podcast, where we empower you to build a better ranch and transform your operations into a thriving business. I'm your host, John Haskell. Let's get started. Alex McKiernan, welcome to the Ranchonomics Podcast. Great to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John.
You bet. Alex and his wife, Chloe, farm in Nebraska, and I'd like him to give a little bit of introduction about that. But first, I want to describe how we met. We met at an EL meeting, and as most of you know, they do a morning run, and Alex and I got to hang out for about an hour while he totally kicked my butt while we were running down the road in the dark around Billings, going who knows where, following John Locke and Shannon Sims and having a nice time. But we met there and kind of got to know each other, and Alex shared his story, and it became a story that I really would like more people to hear because I think it's something that would help a lot of us to sort of think better. And most of you know I'm really interested in mindset stuff and how it affects how we run our business. And I think Alex has a lot to offer here. So Alex, tell us a little about Robinette Farms.
Sure. So Robinette Farms is owned by myself and my wife, Chloe Diegel. We're in southeastern Nebraska. And the mission of Robinette is great food that transforms people and the land, which is something, we followed Dave Pratt's mission creation process in the last couple months with a facilitator and came up with that. And we were really excited. We feel really strongly about that. Great food that transforms people and the land. So what we do at Robinette is sort of two main tracks. We have a direct market business that's vegetables and meat. We produce some of those vegetables. We produce some of that meat in the form of grass-finished beef. And then we consolidate, aggregate a lot of other local food producers and direct market that into Lincoln and Omaha. And in the past, we've grown every type of vegetable you can think of and raised most meat you can think of. And we've really settled down into some specific high value baby greens and microgreens that are grown in greenhouses and hoop houses, and then the grass finished beef. And then we get a lot of other local produce, and we have this local food subscription. That's one arm of Robinette Farms. And then the other arm is more ranch focused. So we have a property further southeast, about an hour and a half straight south of Omaha. And that is at this point, a custom grazing operation. So we graze seasonally anywhere like 300 to 500 head of animals, cattle at this point mostly. But that part of the world, we have a lot of, I'm not allowed to say woody encroachment anymore, John. My hired man has me trained in on that. That's woody forage right there.
Good. We've refocused on that.
That's right. So we are looking at adding goats because we do have quite a bit of more woody species. Well, there are beavers there as well, and we've put in beaver dam analogs. And, the motivation for that property is really more based on transforming the land kind of aspect of our mission about improving grasslands. And yeah, there's a lot of deeply incised streams and erosion there. So we've been putting in beaver dam analogs and some of these post structures to slow water down. And we did have beavers in there at one point, and I'd love to see more, but for now, that's all we got.
We might have to come back and talk about that more. That's interesting stuff. Who are you working with on your structure implementation and that sort of thing?
Well, my hired man, Matt Parag, he came to us out of Lincoln, didn't have any livestock experience, but is really passionate about landscapes and conservation and working with the systems that are there, permaculture kind of ideas. And so he brought some of those, and I've heard about them other places, but when we were doing other dirt work on the property, we had a big excavator there. We mostly just pushed with the big excavator, pushed a bunch of Osage orange posts, hedge posts down in the ground. We've got a lot of hedge in our country, and pushed those into the stream bed, and Matt wove in other willow branches and things, and pretty low tech, but they're holding water back and slowing things down. So we'll see what they do.
Cool. That sounds awesome. And the woody stuff that's encroaching down there, is it mostly Osage? Is it juniper or cedar or?
There's a lot of cedar. There's a lot of hedge, Osage, honey locust, black locust, hackberry, Siberian elm, mulberry, buckbrush. We got all kinds. We get it all down here.
Very good. My daughter learned about honey locusts this summer while we were gathering some calves with some friends down in Kansas. She took one right above her eye. That
I was going to say they are brutal. They're no fun.
We're not tree people, right? So if we run into a tree, it's a pine tree or an aspen, and this thing stuck her right in the eye, and she was like, oh. Anyway, it was pretty unpleasant start to the day.
This is another podcast, but regardless of what you think of climate changing, et cetera, there's certainly more carbon in the atmosphere than there ever was before. at least in our history. And that actually makes it easier for woody plants to grow. So no matter where you are, there's going to be more woody forages, and we got to find a way to manage them. And that's hopefully what goats will do for us. So
cool. Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. All right. Well, let's get into the next part, if that's all right, because you and I had a wonderful discussion and you impressed the heck out of me because you have endured a couple of things, one in particular that was kind of challenging, and I'd like you to visit about that. As I said, when we were running the first morning, I was running, you were rolling.
That's right.
Cheating, I think, driving some sort of wheeled vehicle. And it's how you get around. So let's talk a little about that because it's quite the story.
Yeah. Well, almost 11 years ago, so January 7th, 2014, I was making a delivery into Lincoln, Nebraska in our vehicle, and I was stopped at a light on the highway south of Lincoln. There's a divided highway that has a few lights in it as it gets close to the city of Lincoln. And this is the first one south of Lincoln. So I was stopped at the light, clear, dry day in January, about 1 p.m., and a guy hit me from behind going highway speed. And I was in a small Subaru hatchback, and probably, I think before the accident, there was about 6 feet of space between that rear bumper and my seat. And afterwards, there's about 18 inches. So the whole back of the car just came up into my seat. I had my seatbelt on. Super lucky that there was no one in front of me at the light, and there was no cross traffic, and I was driving a manual transmission, so I was sitting there in neutral. And the force of the impact drove that bumper up into the back of my seat, but it also just pushed me through the intersection, and I kind of gently rolled to a stop in the ditch after 75 or 100 feet. And since I had my seatbelt on, my hips stayed in place, but my whole back kind of stretched up and back, and the rear seats came up into the back of my seat. And the force of that impact stretched my spinal cord and just created like a 1 centimeter bruise on my cord. It broke my T12 vertebrae as well all the way through, but it didn't move. I was very fortunate in that way. Normally, when you have a spinal cord injury, the vertebrae moves and crushes your cord or cuts your cord in some way. That wasn't the case for me. It was literally just they call it a traction injury. The spinal cord was moving, getting dragged through the spinal column, and it bruised it. And just that 1 centimeter bruise was enough that it paralyzed me at that moment from about my belly button down. Couldn't move my legs at all. And I just was sitting there stuck in the car feeling these waves of numbness rolling down my legs, which was terrifying. That was one of the most terrifying feelings. I'm an EMT and a volunteer firefighter, and my pager was going off because it was in our district. So it was all my buddies who came and cut me out of that car and put me on the helicopter. But in the moment, it felt like a big softball size ball bearing that someone heated up in a fire and just shoved into my lower back, like intense pressure and searing hot pain, which I came to learn was nerve pain. I'd never experienced nerve pain, but pretty terrible, strange pain. So those guys cut me out of the car. And as they were loading me on the helicopter, one of my brothers on the fire department said, "What do you want me to do about Chloe?" And so I said, "Well, tell her to call her mom and her cousin and have her meet you at the hospital." Because we had at the time 9-month-old twins and a 3-year-old daughter, 3 daughters that we have. So they went and picked her up and drove her to the hospital. And slowly the picture came into focus that I had what's called an incomplete spinal cord injury. So if you have a complete spinal cord injury, it means you don't have any function all the way at the base of your spine, sensation or function. And I had an incomplete injury, which means I had no function. I couldn't move anything below the level of injury, but I could feel a little bit. And that's a good start. Mm-hmm. It's a real black box when you have a spinal cord or any neurologic injury, stroke, spinal cord, traumatic brain injury. You have no idea what your outcome's going to be. No one can take a scan and say, "Oh, well, in 3 months, you're going to do X, Y, and Z." It's a black box. And so that was almost 11 years ago now. I can walk. I walk with crutches. You've seen me walking. I can do like a party trick and not use the crutches and kind of tightrope walk around, but it's not very useful. I won't get very far. Can't carry anything. And then I use a wheelchair quite a bit. So like when you guys were running, because you like to show off, I pushed along next to you, and I can keep up pretty good doing that as well. And then I use a wheelchair around the house. I could walk all day, every day, but the analogy I make is sort of like you walking backwards. You could do that all day, every day.
Mhm.
But why would you? It's a pain in the butt, and you'd probably fall more often, and you'd get tired, and your body's not built for that. And in the same way, my body's not built for walking with crutches or pushing a wheelchair. And so I have to kind of try to take care of myself and do exercises to keep my shoulders healthy and my core healthy. And I try to stay active and exercise. And I've been fortunate to do fun adventures that challenge my body, even though I've been injured.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I talk to a lot of people who struggle to fully implement the new wonderful things they learned from continuing education. You take ranching for profit, you go to a stockmanship class, or you take a marketing course, and you come home and you struggle to fully implement what you now know. Often the barrier isn't what you know, it's your own mind. Bud Williams used to tell us to get our mind right constantly. We know a lot of the right things, but implementing them often requires a new mindset. Fred Provenza describes conquering your own mind as the longest 6 inches, the distance between your ears. Sometimes you need to unlearn a few things you think you know. In the Zone Rancher course offered through ranching.fyi, Bob Palmer teaches us how to have an elite-level mindset. Bob has spent his career working with Olympic-level athletes, the military and business people, teaching them how to work in the mental zone where they are most effective. We've all experienced the feeling of choking. Many of us know that we don't perform at our best under pressure. Many of us have also experienced the zone as a fleeting moment of brilliance when we perform at our best. Bob helps prepare us mentally for those high-stress situations where the consequences are dire and/or the stakes are high. He teaches us how to practice correctly to get our mind right. He has developed tools that allow us to consistently perform at our best in the moments when we need it the most. Life in the zone is better. It's better for your business. It's better for your family. Join the next round of Zone Rancher through www.ranching.fyi and lead yourself and those around you to a whole new level.
That's a pretty amazing series of events. Let's talk a little about recovery. So you talked through the accident. Now, I have heard your telling of a story of how your sense of humor sort of came back fairly quickly, even before you'd left the hospital the first time. But let's talk about the recovery from it and what all was involved.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I think about this. Some of this is mindset, but some of it is just dumb luck. Like Lincoln, Nebraska has one of the premier spinal cord injury hospitals literally in the world. And I'm very passionate about Madonna Rehabilitation Hospitals. I'm on their board of directors, which I'm very flattered to be a part of. Super well-run place, and it's right in our backyard. So we live about 20, 30 minutes outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. And that's where I ended up. For 2 months, I was an inpatient at Madonna Rehab, working on the spinal cord injury. And then I did outpatient care there for a couple years afterwards. And in those first 2 months, it was pretty mind-boggling. I mean, the thing that happens in a traumatic injury like that, or any traumatic situation, is that you kind of lose your identity a little bit, right? Like I identified myself as, big and strong and capable, and suddenly I can hardly go to the bathroom by myself. It's whiplash, literally and figuratively.
Right.
And it was amazing to see lots of patients in there for months who couldn't accept the reality of what's happening. And, that word acceptance is a hard one. I know you and I have talked about. It doesn't mean quitting. People think if you accept something, you quit. That's not what I mean. What I mean is it's important to accept the reality of your situation, whatever that may be.
Yep.
I haven't met Bud Williams, but I hear you guys talk about him all the time. And one quote I've heard attributed to him is, well, first you got to get your mind right.
Yeah.
And that was something early on in my recovery that I hadn't heard his quote of that yet, but it made a lot of sense to me. They had told me, like, we don't know where you're going to get. No doctor can say what your recovery is going to be. And that's really terrifying, right? Because if you break your leg, they say, well, we're going to do this. And then in a couple months, you'll be here. And
6 weeks, yeah.
And you don't have that. And it's, of course, after you've lost like your identity of yourself. And so that's really hard, that uncertainty. And for me in particular, uncertainty is a challenge for my mind to deal with. And so I remember early on them saying, well, in 6 months or 12 months, you might get a sense of where you're going to end up, but we don't know where it is right now. And, my goal at the time was, I want to walk again. They say, what's your goal? Well, I want to walk again. But what I meant by that was I want to be normal, right? I want to be who I was.
Let's go back to, the day before the accident or the 10 minutes before
Because I can walk. I can walk now, but it's nothing like I used to be able to walk. I can't jump. I can't run. That's not what I meant when I said I want to walk. I meant I want to be who I was.
Yeah.
And there's something implicit in that I want to be who I was that's I don't like who I am.
Right.
And that's corrosive. And you have to be very careful with that because you want to have these goals to push yourself and recover and get back to those things. But at the same time, I'm pretty valuable now, right? I mean, I have this beautiful family. I have a business. I have friends that care for me. I have lots of great things in my life. And I was reflecting on those early on and starting to think, well, if I never walk again, then what? Is that a terrible thing? And I verbalized that at one point to a guy who came to visit me. And I started to say, if I never walk, and he cut me off, he said, you will walk again.
Right.
You will. And he thought I was quitting.
Right.
And I wasn't. What I was saying to myself was, if I don't have that, what else do I have? What other wonderful things do I have already? And it really solidified to me that if I waited 3 months or 6 months or a year to say, well, I'm okay, I guess I like myself, that's a hell of a lot of wasted time of implicitly hating yourself, right? And not liking your body. And that just struck me as a real waste, There's a ton of research out there. I can't quote any of it. I should probably Google around so I can quote some, but there's a ton of research out there about positive outlook and the physical impact that can have on you. And the way I came to think about it is that anybody with some sort of neurologic injury, there's some maximum recovery that you can get to. Nobody knows what it is, right? It's out there. It depends on your body. It depends on your health. It depends on what you eat. It depends on how severe the injury was. And at some point, it depends on your mental outlook.
Yep.
Your emotional well-being, right? That's one of the roles in there. And I always felt like I got to start there. If I can, the only way I get all those other things, healthcare, food, all that other stuff, is if I have this positive attitude. And so that for me, I sum up in the word acceptance, of just accepting the reality, not quitting, but just recognizing the hole you might be in.
Yeah. So I want to dive into this positive thinking a little bit more because I think there are a lot of pretty impressive misconceptions around that. And you're hitting on a number of them, but I want to be a little more explicit. So your friend, and I'll be right honest, I feel terrible for people that are in his position, right? Because what he's worried about, right? And what he's trying to do. The idea that, we just positive think our way into all kinds of things is not entirely incorrect. And yet at the same time, what you're talking about may sound like not being positive, right? When you're talking about acceptance. And just as it isn't giving up, it's also not just sort of BSing yourself into some fantasy that, like you're saying, leads to this great disjoint, if you will, between reality and where you want to go, right? So Alex post-surgery says, I want to deadlift 400 pounds. Like, right. Well, we can talk about that if you want, but that's going to be a long road. But at the same time, it also doesn't mean, well, I'm never going to do that again. So I'm just going to lay here and watch TV and eat oxycodone all day long.
Yeah, I got sick of that pretty quick.
So can you flesh that out a little? Because there's a lot to this, I think.
Oh, there's a ton to it. I will do my best to flesh it out. One thing I will preface this with is that I'm no expert on these things.
But you are a practitioner.
I'm a practitioner. I've been super fortunate in my life for all the things that have come to me that I didn't choose or do. One of those is, to some extent, the positive outlook. Like, my default is, well, what can we do about it? That's kind of where I get to. I may wallow and suffer for a while, but eventually I get bored and say, well, I guess what can we do about it? I didn't choose that. I think I've always been that way. So in some ways, I got pitched a bit of a softball with this challenge. And then I've had so much community support in terms of family and friends, and people gave us money and supported us. And I know a lot of people who don't have it that easy, that have challenges with anxiety or depression or any number of things that I don't have to deal with, I don't think, on the same level as other people. So I do want to preface that like, I'm very fortunate that I kind of default to some of that outlook. And I do want to go back to like, it is really hard to be in that position of the person coming to visit or the family member watching someone else suffer. I totally get that. I think that would be harder for me than being in the position I was. The one thing I want to point out there is like, don't feel sorry for people. If you show up to someone who's got an injury like that and you're in your words and in your body, you're saying, I feel sorry for them. You can read that. You can read pity and it sucks. Show up and be present with somebody. Be there with them. If they're having a happy, fun day, be happy and have fun with them. If they're having a terrible day, then just say, wow, that's a challenge, but just be present with them. And I think that's where I'd like to take that question, is about presence. In terms of mindset, something bad happens to you, or you're in pain, or you've lost something, your identity, your body function, whatever. If you can sit with that and just recognize those things without judging them, without playing them forward into pain and continued loss and perpetual suffering, then you can just recognize those feelings. You can be present with them without judging them. You can sit with them. And I think that allows you to have more of a positive outlook, because if you can have this sort of non-judgmental view of those circumstances and extract yourself a bit. What's the saying? Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional.
I was just going to ask you about that, so that's perfect.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, that typifies that view, I think. Everyone is going to lose and be in pain somehow, some way in their lives. And again, I don't claim to be an expert at not suffering. my children and my wife say differently, but that is certainly my goal, is to try to let go of those things that I can't control, be present with those feelings, thoughts, concerns, and let them pass, because they eventually will,
Yeah, and let's get into a bit of the cause of suffering right here for just a moment. Because in your mind, what causes that? So pain, right? Pain's inevitable, right? We're all going to experience loss. We're all going to experience difficulty, challenge, or we're going to get knocked off course again and again. The cause of suffering in your mind is what? What makes that difference?
Well, I mean, I could take you back to sitting in my crushed car on the roadside, and I have a distinct memory of this. I can't move my legs. I'm stuck in my seat. Numbness is rolling down my legs. And it just so happened that a very skilled paramedic was driving by, and he was a friend of mine, and hopped in the back of the car and was holding my neck so that I didn't, if I had a cervical spine injury, it wasn't worsened. And I started blubbering and saying, I'm never going to walk again. I'm never going to walk again. Well, that was my condition at the moment, right? And I was in a lot of physical pain, but all of the suffering that I had in my mind was about a projected future that didn't exist. It wasn't here. And in fact, it's not true, right? So when you play things forward in a terribly negative way or in a terribly positive way, that might also, you might suffer from that as well. None of those things are real. They aren't happening. They haven't happened. The only thing that's happening is right here and now. And so, if you're afraid, if you are anxious, you're playing out all of these nightmare scenarios that aren't real and don't exist. And that causes suffering that I think is avoidable if you can learn to control your mind a little bit.
Okay, good. Alex, I want to wrap up this episode. We're going to visit again because we have a lot to talk about. The point you're making here, I think, is best written about by Viktor Frankl. And I don't know if you've read Man's Search for Meaning.
I have not.
It is a book written by Viktor Frankl, was a concentration camp survivor in Nazi Germany. And he decided the one thing he could control was how he thought. And that when he controlled that, he basically controlled everything. And it's an absolutely remarkable story. He's a wonderful writer. He was some sort of psychiatrist, psychologist type person, but, came into the concentration camp with quite a background in about how people think and that sort of thing, and who used that experience as a transformational one in his life. And it's a very short book. It's one of these, 120 pages. But it is a powerful read. That's one I've decided in my life I try to reread about once a year because it's a good Good slap in the face. Like, oh, you think you're having a hard,
Yeah, right.
All right, but let's wrap that up. We're going to continue on. So I want people to come back next week and hear more of this, but let's just real quickly, Robinette Farms, you guys have a website, correct?
Yep. RobinetteFarms.com.
Great. And repeat your mission, because I really like that mission. It's a great one.
Yeah. Our mission is great food that transforms people and the land.
Awesome.
And we really feel like so much of the loss and people's health challenges and environmental degradation comes to people losing sight of the fact that we're connected to land and we're connected to the planet. And we need to be involved with it. And so that's what we hope we can do with great food that transforms people on the land.
Pretty cool. All right. Good. Thank you. We will come back next week. We are going to talk a little about more of sort of the recovery process and the mindset process when we come back. But thanks for joining me today and look forward to visiting with you again.
I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, John.
You bet.
Thank you for tuning into the Ranchnomics podcast. We hope this episode helped you win today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend.